The Name of the Rose by Umberto Eco, A Discernment by Christopher Robert Neal, Juris Doctorate. In this discernment, I will be reading The Name of the Rose and stopping to translate the various languages that are here, Italian, French, etc., and offering commentary as we go along. I am going to treat this, a Juris Doctorate is a doctorate of law. I'm going to treat this as I would a report or a fact pattern, we call them in law school, by the detective himself and see what we would do in terms of making out what actually happened in prosecuting. I also may treat it as a judge or just as someone interested. This I've read about 50 or 60 pages of this famous book and intentionally stopped to learn more about the orders that were taking place here in the different religious rites. Something to begin at the very beginning. Of the nearly 8 billion people or humans upon the earth, many of them are religious. 2 billion or so of them call themselves followers of Jesus, are Christians. 1 billion of them or so call themselves Catholics, which means they believe their beliefs are universally applicable. And most of them would agree that they follow the Pope in Rome currently. The Holy Father is Pope Francis the First, whom I consider also the Archduke of Piedmont, giving him right to, when it's time, recrown the King of Italy, who is the Prince of Venice and considered the Prince of Piedmont. And Umberto Eco grew up in Piedmont himself, so there's a crossover there. And as we go through this, remember, we are also talking about organizations which function like uh, related to but separate entities which have their own approach to the great question of what is it that Jesus meant and what did he want people to do, and what else besides Jesus' message do you apply? Uh, there are vows that men take. Those vows these men take, and they vary. One of them is to celibacy. And you should know that celibacy means not getting married. And of course, within marriage, preventing one, so they don't get married. And in the Catholic Church, marriage is between a man and a woman, and that's how things have always been. Everything the Catholic Church does, it's for a consistency reason, and so they don't get married, and they don't get married, which means that they do not become long-term partners with women, uh, even girlfriends or any of that nature. And oftentimes, their only relationship with women is a formal one, polite but formal, in relation to their duties. Some also have a vow of celibacy, which is to prevent themselves from even thinking about sexual relationships with women. Beyond that, everyone has their own approach to why they're in the hospital of uh, of a monastery, of a university, of another place, and how they are working on their own souls. It is essentially a beautifully selfish tradition in terms of reproduction, but they meet that obligation by offering a significant amount of love and grace. So listen to it, and as we go through this, keep in mind these are human beings whose only vow is not to get married, and as long as they keep that vow, you'll hear throughout the book they may have other vows as well. When those vows are broken, it is required that someone investigate why the vow was broken And what is the proper recourse for it? That recourse is not normally going to be exile. It's going to be some discussion. For instance, if your son or daughter cheats on their advanced placement history exam, United States history exam, they could get kicked out of school, but more likely they're going to receive detention and be required possibly to repeat that exam. And after the detention is fulfilled and they've repeated the exam, they'll have whatever grade they have with it. And except for a few people who may want to remind them of it, that issue will be over. Similarly, with the vows taken by these gentlemen, it'll be over at that point. Whatever that happens to be, there is forgiveness available, which is something unique to the Abrahamic faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, whereas others practice non judgment. But specifically, Catholicism makes it a point to bring people into a unique setting from which they seek forgiveness by explaining what they've done. And someone goes down a list or another source, maybe their own bishop, and finds out what do we do or what have we done over the last 2,000 and I would argue 2,800 years when this situation has arisen, and how do we take care of it? Okay, so I will continue with the reading of the book. Umberto Eco, The Name of the Rose, Naturally a Manuscript. Preface. On August 16, 1968, I was handed a book written by a certain Abbe Vallée.
Le manuscrit de Dom Hudson de Melk, traduit en français d'après l'édition de Dom J. Mabillon, aux presses de l'Abbaye de la Source, Paris, 1842. The manuscript by Dom Adson de Melk, translated into French from the edition by Dom J. Mabillon, Aux Presses de Source Abbey, Paris, 1842.
Translate.google.com, supplemented by historical information that was actually quite scant. The book claimed to reproduce faithfully a 14th century manuscript, in its turn, had been found in the monastery of Melk by the great 18th century man of learning, to whom we owe so much information about the history of the Benedictine order. The scholarly discovery, I mean mine, the third in chronological order, entertained me while I was in Prague, waiting for a dear friend. Six, 6 days later, Soviet troops invaded that unhappy city. I managed, not without adventure, to reach the Austrian border at Linz, and from there I journeyed to Vienna, where I met my beloved, and together we sailed up the Danube. In a state of intellectual excitement, I read with fascination the terrible story of Atso of Melk, and I allowed myself to be absorbed by it and I allowed myself to be so absorbed by it that, almost in a single burst of energy, I completed a translation, using some of those large notebooks from the papeterie Joseph Gibbard, in which it is so pleasant to write if you use a felt tip pen. And as I was writing, we reached the vicinity of Milk, where, perched over a bend in the river, the handsome stift stands to this day. After several restorations during the course of the centuries, As the reader must have guessed, in the monastery library I found no trace of Atso's manuscript. Before we reached Salzburg, one tragic night in a little hotel on the shores of Mondsee, my traveling companionship was abruptly interrupted, and the person with whom I was traveling disappeared, taking Abbe Vallet's book, not out of spite, but because of the abrupt and untidy way in which our relationship ended. And so I was left with a number of manuscript notebooks in my hand and a great emptiness in my heart. A few months later in Paris, I decided to get to the bottom of my research. Among the few pieces of information I had derived from the French book, I still had the reference to its source, exceptionally detailed and precise.
Vetera analecta, sive collectio veterum aliquot operum and opusculorum OMMS generis. Carminum, epistolarum, diplomaton, epitaphiorum, and cum itinere Germanico. Ad notationibus and aliquot disquisitionibus R. Pt. Joannis Mabillon, Presbyteria C. Monachi Ord. Sancti Benedicti e Congregatione S. Mauri, nova editio cui accessere Mabiloi vita and aliquot opuscula. Scilicet dissertatio de pane eucharistico. Azimo et fermentato ad eminentis. Cardinalem bona. Subiungitur opusculum Eldefonsi Hispaniensis episcopi de eodem argumento et Eusebii Romani ad Theophilum Gallum epistola. De cultu sanctorum ignotorum, Parisiis, apud levesque, ad pontem esse Michaelis. MDCCXXI. Cum privilegio regis. An Analecta of the Old, or a collection of some old works and essays of all kinds, poems, letters, diplomas, epitaphs, and, with the German journey, notes, etc. investigations RPD. John Mabillon, presbyter and monk Ord, Saint Benedict from the Congregation of Saint Maury, a new addition to which Mabilloy's life and some essays should be added, namely the dissertation on pain Eucharistic. Unleavened and fermented to eminentis. Good Cardinal, the essay of Ildefonsus is appended epistle of the Bishop of Spain on the same subject, and the letter of Eusebius Romanus to Theophilus Gallus. On worship of the unknown saints, in Paris, at L'Evêque, at the Bridge of Saint Michael, 1821, with the privilege of the king.
I found the Vetera Analecta at the Biblioteca Saint Genevieve, but to my great surprise, the edition I came upon differed from the description in two details. First, the publisher, who was given here as Mont Allant ad Repam pp. Agostinia Norum Trope Pontem es Michaelis, and also the date, which was 2 years later. I needn't add that these Analecta did not comprehend any manuscript of Atso or Adson of Milk. On the contrary, as anyone interested can check, they are a collection of brief or medium length texts, whereas the story transcribed by Vallée ran to several hundred pages. At the same time, I consulted illustrious medievalists such as the dear and unforgettable Etienne Gilson, but it was evident that the only Vetera and Electa were those I had seen at St. Genevieve. A quick trip to the Abbaye de la Source in the vicinity of Passe and a conversation with my friend Dom Orne Lanestet further convinced me that no Abbey valet had published books on the Abbey's presses, for that matter non existent. French scholars are notoriously careless about furnishing reliable bibliographical information, but this case went beyond all reasonable pessimism. I began to think I had encountered a forgery. By now, the valet volume itself could not be recovered, or at least I didn't dare go and ask it back from the person who had taken it from me. I had only my notes left, and I was beginning to have doubts about them. There are magic moments involving great physical fatigue and intense motor excitement that produce visions of people known in the past.
En me retraçant ces détails, j'en suis à me demander s'ils sont réels, ou bien si je les ai rêvés. When retracing these details, I wonder if they are real, or if I dreamed them.
As I learned later from the delightful little book of the Abbé de Bouquois, there are also visions of books as yet unwritten. If something new had not occurred, I would still be wondering where the story of Atso of Milk originated. But then, in 1970, in Buenos Aires, as I was browsing among the shelves of a little antiquarian bookseller on Corrientes, not far from the more illustrious Patio del Tango of that great street, I came upon the Castilian version of a little work by Milo Temesvar on the use of mirrors in the game of chess. It was an Italian translation of the original, which, now impossible to find, was in Georgian, Tbilisi, 1934. And here, to my great surprise, I read copious quotation I read copious quotations from Atzo's manuscript, though the source was neither Valet nor Mabillon. It was Father Athanasius Kircher, but which work? A scholar, whom I prefer not to name, later assured me that, and he quoted indexes from memory, the great Jesuit never mentioned Atso of Milk, but Temesvar's pages were before my eyes, and the episodes he cited were the same as those of the Valet manuscript. The description of the labyrinth in particular left no room for doubt. I concluded that Atso's memoirs appropriately share the nature of the events he narrated, shrouded in many shadowy mysteries, beginning with the identity of the author and ending with the abbey's location, about which Atso is stubbornly, scrupulously silent. Conjecture allows us to designate a vague area between Pomposa and Conques, with reasonable likelihood that the community was somewhere along the central ridge of the Apennines between Piedmont, Liguria, and France. As for the period in which the events described take place, we are at the end of November 1327, the date of the author's writing on the other hand, is uncertain. Inasmuch as he describes himself as a novice in 1327 and says he is close to death as he writes his memoirs, we can calculate roughly that the manuscript was written in the last or next to last decade of the 14th century. On sober reflection, I find few reasons for publishing my Italian version of an obscure Neo Gothic French version of a 17th century Latin edition of a work written in Latin by a German monk toward the end of the 14th century. First of all, what style should I employ? The temptation to follow Italian models of the period had to be rejected as totally unjustified. Not only does Azzo write in Latin, but it is also clear from the whole development of the text that his culture, or the culture of the abbey, which clearly influences him, dates back even further. It is manifestly a summation over several centuries of learning and stylistic quirks that can be linked with the late medieval Latin tradition. Adso thinks and writes like a monk who has remained impervious to the revolution of the vernacular, still bound to the pages housed in the library he tells about, educated on educated on patristic scholastic texts and his story, apart from the 14th century references and events, which Adso reports with countless perplexities and always by hearsay, could have been written as far as the language and the learned quotations go in the 12th or 13th century. On the other hand, there is no doubt that in translating Atso's Latin into his own Neo Gothic French, Vallée took some liberties, and not only stylistic liberties. For example, the character speaks sometimes of the properties of herbs, clearly referring to the Book of Secrets attributed to Albertus Magnus, which underwent countless revisions over the centuries. It is certain that Atso knew the work, but the fact remains that passages he quotes from it echo too literally both formulas of Paracelsus and obvious interpolations from an edition of Albertus unquestionably dating from the Tudor period. Note 1.
Liber aggregationis seu liber secretorum Alberti Magni, Londinium, juxta pontem qui vulgariter dicitur flete bridge. MCCCCLXXXV. The Book of Aggregation or the Book of Secrets of Albert the Great, London, near the bridge commonly called Fleet Brig, 3385.
And actually, the Roman numeral is 1480. However, I discovered later that during the time when Vallée was transcribing the manuscript of Atso, there was circulating in Paris an 18th century edition of the Grand and the Petite Albert, note 2.
Les admirables secrets d'Albert le Grand, à Lyon, chez les héritiers Beringot, Frâtre, à l'enseigne d'Agrippa, MDCCLXXV, secrets merveilleux de la magie naturelle et kabbalistique du petit Albert. À Lyon, chez les héritiers Beringot, Frâtre, à l'enseigne d'Agrippa, MDCCXXIX. The admirable secrets of Albert the Great, in Lyon, among the heirs Beringos, freighters, at the sign of Agrippa, MDCCLXXV. Wonderful secrets of the natural and Kabbalistic magic of Petit Albert, in Lyon. Chez les héritiers Beringos, freighters, at the ensign of Agrippa, MDCCXXIX.
Or 1729. Now, irreparably corrupt. In any case, how could I be sure that the texts known to Adso are the monks whose discussions he recorded did not also contain, among gloss, scholia, and various appendices, annotations that would go on to enrich subsequent scholarship? Finally, was I to retain in Latin the passages that Abbe Vallée himself did not feel it opportune to translate, perhaps to preserve the ambiance of the period? There was no particular reasons to do so except a perhaps misplaced sense of fidelity to my source. I have eliminated excesses. I have eliminated excesses or excesses, but I have retained a certain amount, and I fear that I have imitated those bad novelists who, introducing a French character, make him exclaim, Parbleu, or La femme, la femme, or les filles, les filles. In short, I am full of doubts. I really don't know why I have decided to pluck up my courage and present, as if it were authentic, the manuscript of Atso of Milk. Let us say it is an act of love, or if you like, a way of ridding myself of numerous, persistent obsessions. I transcribe my text with no concern for timeliness. In the years when I discovered the Abbé Vallée volume, there was a wide conviction that one should write only out of a commitment to the present, in order to change the world. Now, after 10 years or more, the man of letters, restored to his loftiest dignity, can happily write out of pure love of writing. And so I now feel free to tell, for sheer narrative pleasure, the story of Atso of Milk, and I am confronted and consoled in finding it immeasurably remote in time, now that the waking of reason has dispelled all the monsters that its sleep had generated, gloriously lacking in any relevance for our day, atemporally alien to our hopes and our certainties. For it is a tale of books, not of everyday worries, and reading it can lead us to recite with Akempis, the great imitator,
In omnibus requiem quaesivi, et nusquam inveni nisi in angulo cum libro. I looked for rest in everything, and found nowhere but in a corner with a book.
so that is the end of the preface. And taking from what I've just read, that should I only include what is written here, or should I add more? I'll do a little of both. I will continue to translate the text that is here and not in English, and I will say things like I will add things to the end of it, or who is retains, or some uh, thought or pattern or something that I've retained from it as well. But overwhelmingly, keep these brief, and hopefully, after 100 or so of these, if not more, there will be something. There'll be something interesting that comes from it. Today is uh, July 29th, 2022, uh, 13:25 hours Pacific Standard Time, or 1:25 p.m. And I'm your reader, Christopher Neal, Juris Doctorate.